Hi, everybody. This is Hondo Carpenter from Sports Illustrated's Fan Nation, Las Vegas Raiders Insider Podcast, part of the Fans First Sports Network, joined by my buddy Matt Halatic from thespun.com. Matt, camp has sprung. Players will be arriving today, tomorrow, the veterans, and we get going big time on Wednesday. So I just want to ask you, first of all, Jimmy Garoppolo passes his physical. We've talked about that ad nauseum, that we expected that. Nothing was different. The issue is going to be, can he play 17 games? Your thoughts on the Jimmy Garoppolo situation?
Well, obviously, it's a little bit of a sigh of relief for now, at least, to know that that's out of the way. Even though the Raiders had said they expected it, and we've been saying we expected it, it's still good for it to be reality. Garoppolo passes physical, he'll be there ready to go this week. I expect them to, they're obviously going to watch monitor his health a lot throughout the course of August because they need him healthy for week one. And then it really becomes a question of, is he going to be, like you said, somebody who you can count on week in and week out and is going to play a full 17 game schedule or at least 15, 16 games. Maybe he misses a game here or there or something like that, but is somebody you can really count on as their starting quarterback.
For you, I mean, we've talked about it so much, but I think now with camp starting, it's important to talk again. If he stays healthy all 17 games, then at the price that they paid, which is still a lot of money, but not a lot at quarterback, then the Raiders did some good there. If he didn't, then all the blame's going to sit on McDaniels and Ziegler. Would you agree or disagree?
I would, because I think they're putting a lot of faith in Jimmy, because this year behind him, you have Brian Hoyer, a vet, and you have a young mid-round quarterback in Aiden O'Connell. So you don't have your quarterback of the future, high draft pick or somebody that is good, the franchise is banking on yet. So Jimmy's the guy for this year. And then, what they do beyond that, I think kind of might be based off of how his first season goes. Does he stay healthy? Does he play well? Can they trust him? Okay, well then maybe you look at him as your guy again in 2024. If not, then you're starting to really scout the quarterback market in the draft or maybe even in free agency or trade, whatever, and you're kind of retooling and doing things differently on the fly.
So let's talk about training camp and some of the biggest questions. I think the first thing is going to be the Raiders are much deeper. There's no doubt about that at every position, almost every position. Some of them they didn't have to do much. But the point of the matter is they are deeper. I think competition is the biggest thing that you're going to watch in camp this year. There's legitimate competitions at almost, not all, but almost every position. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's always the most fun part of any training camp, any football training camp, is the competition position battles day in and day out to see who's going to start or who's going to get a spot on the roster. I have my eyes, and we've talked about this a lot. And I think we talked about it either last week or the week before. My eyes are focused on the two lines. I want to see who's going to. There's a couple of starting spots that are set in on the offensive line, of course. Colton Miller, Dylan Parham, guys like that. I want to see who solidifies themselves as the starters at the other three spots, and then how the top, say, two backup spots shake out. Because you really need seven linemen you can kind of count on to put in games uh, at a moment's notice. If you have more than that, that's even better. But you really need to be able to have seven reliable enough offensive linemen. So how those spots 3 through 7 shake out to me will be paramount to the Raiders' their ability to have a good season. And I think that on the defensive line, we talked about all the competition at defensive tackle. I think they kind of have their guys set at the top of the depth chart, Bilal Nichols, Jerry Tillery. But beyond that, how does the depth chart shake out? Byron Young is not healthy to start camp. Now, he's going to make the roster. He's a rookie third round draft pick. But how is him not being out on the field to start camp impact some of these guys that are battling for roster spots? They get more of an opportunity. Who takes advantage of it? So those are my places where I would be keeping an eye on if I'm a Raider beat writer or a Raider fan.
One thing, and again, you can love or hate what they've done. That's certainly anyone's prerogative, but there certainly is a lot of competition. Dave Ziegler does deserve credit for creating competition at almost every position. I think, would you not agree? I mean, his ability to go get a bunch of guys together to compete, I think is going to make the Raiders better just because of that.
I agree. I think when you have every team in the NFL pretty much has certain positions where they have a high-end player or so. The better teams have more. But let's say for the Raiders, you got Davante Adams, a receiver. You have Colton Miller, a left tackle. There's some other guys, but those are
Max
Josh Jacobs,
Crosby
a running back. Max Crosby, of course. You can't forget Max Crosby. So those four
and
right there,
Daniel
definitely.
Carlson, AJ Cole.
Right, exactly. So those are your top end guys right there. At the other spots, if you can't get a player that you think is can develop into one of those top end guys, someone like they hope Tyree Wilson, when he gets healthy, is eventually going to be an elite type player in the league. But if you can't get a player like that, whether in the draft or in free agency, I think the best thing to do is to kind of flood spots with bodies and have a competition and have depth where, okay, we have some B players maybe at these spots, but we have two or three of them. So we can do some different things depending on what guys' skill sets are. If our starter gets hurt, it's not going to cost us that as much to replace him with the guy behind him in the depth chart because they're comparable players. It's not like it's a huge drop off. So I think that's what you see a lot of teams do. If you can't get the high end guys or the guys with high end potential at that time, your best bet is to bring in as much competition as possible and see how it all shakes out. And that's what I think the Raiders have done.
Let's talk about training camp because there's always so much exciting getting to it, but people sometimes don't understand. It is a grind. It's a grind on players, and I find that fascinating that the way it all sets up, the way camp works out, it is a daily job interview. And to me, I think that's a part of camp people don't appreciate.
Without a doubt. And it's not just the physical component of it, it's the mental component of having to go through that routine day after day,
Mhm.
meetings, team meals, training room, practice field, film sessions, more practice, and all these different things that it entails. Um, I think that's why sometimes you see towards the middle and end of camp, you'll see some training camp spats or fights because guys are just raring to go against somebody in a different color jersey and kind of shake things up and it bubbles over a little bit. But I think that mental grind is just as important and just as big of something to overcome in training camp as the day-to-day physical hitting and things that you're doing out on the field.
You know, one of the things that always fascinates me about training camp is obviously the heat. And no
Mm-hmm.
matter where you are, I mean, even in Michigan, where I'm from, I mean, it still can get really hot there, especially with humidity.
Sure.
But you're right. The mental part of camp is the thing. So many players will tell you coming into as rookies, you can prepare for all the physical work, you can have all of the workouts, you can do everything to make sure your body's in tip-tap shape. But it is the mental grind of camp, just the constant grinding that takes its toll, isn't it?
It does. And I think that separates the good players from the great players and the guys who end up not making a roster from the ones who are able to carve out a role and make a roster and make themselves indispensable to the coaching staff. Their ability to kind of keep a level head and to keep focus throughout all the challenges of the summer.
Well, years ago, when I was covering the Lions, Tom Kowalski, who was the late Tom Kowalski, great reporter, him and I were standing there watching a fight at camp. And the fight was over a young player that went low to tackle a guy. They're not in pads, a veteran. And this fight breaks out because they're like, "What are you doing? We don't go to the ground in camp. What do you?" that is the mental preparation because these guys are so used to hitting, taking
Mhm.
guys to the ground. They're excited, testosterone's flowing. I mean, that is the thing in training camp. You just have to avoid stupid injuries and you got to be so mentally tapped in. It's difficult to maintain that first, even though training camp's not as long as it used to be. It's still difficult, isn't it not?
It definitely is, and I think it's definitely part of the shell shock process for rookies, even though they go through their own training camps in college, and college training camp isn't easy. It's still a different structure and different expectations than you have at the professional level. So I think that's something that you want to see how guys adapt as they make that leap. And I think the thing you mentioned about injuries, unfortunately, anytime you have any kind of football practice for a while, those guys are going to get hurt. You hope, but what you hope is you avoid a major training camp injury, and you hope that you avoid, like you said, something that's silly, that's an avoidable training camp injury that's caused by somebody either doing the wrong thing or not concentrating or, being overzealous. That's something that a coaching staff will be ready to. It kills a coaching staff. They're ready to go nuts over it.
Let's talk about Josh Jacobs because I do not believe he's in danger. I mean, I think there are some things that could happen that he would lose his job, but there are things I don't think is going to happen. Mark Davis wants stability. He likes the direction they're going. But let's talk about Josh Jacobs because absolutely having the Mark Davis endorsement is the most important endorsement in Josh McDaniel's life. So he's got that. We understand that. But when you look at his first year, which was disappointing, no playoffs, coming off a playoff year, when you look at what happened in Denver, and I think he's a different person, but it's still relevant, there's a lot of pressure on him. I'm just curious, in your opinion, how do you think that pressure plays on Josh? Now, he comes from a football family, so he's going to tell you there's pressure every year, and he's not lying. That's truthfully how he feels. But the reality is that there is a ton of pressure because it's a wait or see. You got to put up or shut up. Your thoughts on Josh McDaniels?
There is a ton of pressure, and I think I agree with you. I would find it hard to see him losing his job after 2 seasons, given the commitment the Raiders seem to have made to him. But if they don't have an improvement this year, and maybe not necessarily playoffs, but if they win 8 or 9 games, they're in there and they're in a hunt. That'll be enough, I think, where people could say, all right, maybe they're trending upward. If they don't kind of show signs of that this year, the pressure on him in 2024 is going to be immense. And you really don't get, no matter how much an owner may have committed to you, how much an owner may like you don't get a lot of chances to prove yourself at a new coaching job at the NFL level. If you kind of don't do something by year two, people are already saying, is he a dead man walking? And year three, if the first 3 years are critical, you have to show that you're the guy. You have to, get to the playoffs at least once. You have to show you have a concrete vision and you have players believing in and you're building a roster. So if they can't make that sort of progress in year two, the pressure on him in year three is going to be just through the roof.
Yeah, totally agree. So let me ask you this. What are some things that you're wanting to see out of training camp from the Raiders?
Well, I think besides the obvious Josh Jacobs, how long is he out? How long does he report for week one of that storyline that's going on with Saquon Barkley in New York and, some other running backs and players around the league? That's obviously the biggest storyline. But I think I want to see, excuse me, how are these position battles kind of sorting themselves out and what is kind of the vision for this roster and is it starting to come to fruition? Is some of the guys that he's putting his faith in, are they showing themselves to be potential building blocks? Now, you really won't be able to tell that for sure until you get into the season and games start being played. But you'll be able to get an early impression from you and from other reporters with boots on the ground that can see these players day to day. And I think that that's critical because this is a year coming up where we've said, look, the Raiders, they're not going to win a championship. They could make the playoffs if things break right. They have, and if they're playing well, but they're not ready to win a championship yet. But this is the type of season that is critical to their future ability to win a championship because they're in a tough division, and you can't keep spinning your wheels for too long when you're competing against Patrick Mahomes and you're competing against Justin Herbert. And the Broncos seem intent on rebuilding, and they just spent big money on Sean Payton, and they have Russell Wilson. So this is a critical season, I think, to show that the things are trending upward for the Raider franchise.
One of the things that I'm looking for is separation. I want to see guys separate themselves. I want to see guys, go out there and where there's a lot of competition and somebody really take a lead, jump start. To me, that's going to be if you've got a bunch of guys at the same level, I have a feeling that screams of mediocrity. I want to see some guys take some steps. How about you?
I agree. And I think what I said earlier is if you have a bunch of guys that are comparable talent on the depth chart, it can be a good thing if you have to replace or have some kind of interchangeability with pieces. However, if everybody's kind of playing at the same level and is kind of just like no one's seizing those spots at all, and there's no clear delineation between first, second string, then it's an issue because then you're looking at, do we have anything here to really get excited about? So I think, again, we're looking at offensive line, defensive line spots. Who, if Hunter Renfrow was traded like you think he might be, who steps up as that third receiver along with Jacoby Myers and Devontae Adams? How does the tight end how is looking? Obviously, Michael Mayer, Austin Hooper are going to be, those top two guys, but is OJ Howard healthy and forcing his way into the competition? On defense, the secondary has some big position battles, especially with that second safety spot and one of the corner spots. How are those shaking out? Do you have guys that are clearly showing themselves to be worthy of being first stringers? I think that'll go a long way in determining kind of how the Raiders should be feeling going into week one.
All right, I'm going to ask you a little bit of a different question, but last year, Josh McDaniels played Josh Jacobs, but didn't play a lot of his starters. And a lot of people think that hurt the Raiders. I'm curious. Obviously, with Jimmy G, I think they need to be extremely careful with him. But do you think Jimmy G or others, do you think he should play some more guys in the preseason, maybe early? Or did you like his way he did it last year?
I think that I know you want to be really careful with Jimmy G. I kind of lean towards giving him at least a couple of series in one of those games to just kind of get his feet wet with his teammates around. It's his first year on the roster, and you want to give him some game reps. Listen, only 2 preseason games. You're not getting a lot of reps for a lot of players because you're not getting that final preseason game where your roster cut guys are really out there for three and a half quarters fighting for their lives. So there's a lot of guys who are not getting the proper reps. I sort of lean towards taking most, when you're going a little bit more position by position in terms of how much time you give guys in the preseason. I think Jimmy G probably needs a series or two, maybe just to kind of run through some things, but not much more than that.
Mhm.
You know what you're getting from Devontae Adams. You don't have to give him much time. He's going to be ready week one. Um, Josh Jacobs, I don't know if he's going to show up in the preseason, but if he was there, you know what you're getting from him. You really don't need to play him. He's going to be ready week one.
Max
Same thing with
Crosby.
Max Crosby, Colton Miller, um, some other guys. You know what you're going to get. Guys who maybe don't have a lot of depth behind them on the depth chart, and you don't want to risk losing them. You know what they have. But I think, listen, where there's competition, defensive line, a couple of the offensive line spots, the secondary, you want to see them play and you want to see how they do even if they're not necessarily always going up against another team's first stringers, depending on what your opponent in the preseason is doing. But you want to
Mhm.
see how they do in not just those games, but also joint practices are huge as well.
Matt, you and I are both older guys. I'm older than you significantly in my mid 50s, but back in the day, they would have 2 and 3 a days.
Yeah.
That's not the case anymore. They're very restricted. I hear a lot of people talking about it's changing football, it's changing football. I kind of disagree. Not kind of, I do disagree. I think the grind was not good on players. I think it, and when now with limited rosters and everything that they have, I just think it's better. And Josh McDaniels, whether people love him or hate him, spends a ton of time in the classroom. I talked about this last year. This is no secret. He's a teacher, and he will. This is what players will say can be grueling. There's so much film, there's so much classroom with Josh McDaniels, but it really does help the Raiders that they're and first of all, the NFL has reduced the physicality of training camp, but he's even go a step further. I do think that can help him, although going outdoors and then coming into air conditioning in a classroom setting can make eyes very, very heavy. But your thought on Josh's approach, and I know that there was a lot of players that did appreciate it last year.
I think the one area where some of the offseason physical limitations may have hurt teams, and I think you're starting to see franchises adapt to this is along the offensive line because you're getting less time to train your offensive linemen and kind of build that cohesion as a unit. Overall, though, I think that I would rather see guys not beat themselves up early in training camp or early in the season. And I know, listen, going way back, you're talking about in college, the Junction Boys and Bear Bryant and all that stuff. And
Yeah.
I even, going to the early days of the NFL post merger, I've read about, how tough Don Shula's training camps were down in the heat in Miami when they won back-to-back Super Bowls. And, obviously it worked for them. They molded their team, but that's 50 years ago. I think that, things are different now. And I think that you really have to be careful with guys' health. Don't forget also there's one extra regular season game, so guys are gonna have to stay healthy for one extra game during the year, and also the investment you have in players is something that you have to consider. How much money teams are putting into players? You don't want them banged up or hurt if they don't have to be in training camp. So I think overall, it's just part of things sports like business and technology and every other field modernizes over time. And of course, there's some changes we don't love, and there's things we wish we could go back to. But I think this is just one of those things that was natural. And I think overall is probably better for players and teams than if it was the old way.
Well, we wanted to get here. We're here. Camp starts today, but we're still 6 or 7 weeks away from the regular season. The NFL, love them or hate them, has done a masterful job of making their game relevant 52 weeks a year, haven't they?
They certainly have. And I mean, think about it. So what was it, 6 or 7 weeks ago from this, we were talking about, OTAs or whatnot. And it just flies. And, pretty soon we'll be talking about the final 53-man roster and, game predictions and week one. And, this is my favorite time of year. I think when the calendar flips in a week till August, I really, I mean, obviously training camp started by then, but I really get the juices flowing. I feel like when I see August on the calendar because, football is really right around the corner.
All right, let's talk about biggest surprises of camp. Let's talk about on defense. Who's the player that you're looking for really taking a next step? Now, I'm going to name three. And I know when you say a player and then I go plural, it's my fault. But Trayvon Morgan and Nate Hobbs have to take a step up. They both look good as rookies. They did not look good in their sophomore campaigns. But these are two guys and Divine Diablo. Those are the three guys on defense that to me absolutely have to step up this camp.
I agree. I think those are three guys that you're talking about. If they play well the way they have shown they're capable of, in terms, Hobbs and Trayvon Moore, how they looked as rookies as opposed to second year players, and Devon Diablo, how he's looked when he's on the field because he's had some health issues that have slowed him down. They could be foundational pieces. To me, like I said, I'm looking at some of those guys who I'm looking at like a Luke Masterson, who as a rookie last year really showed a lot as an undrafted free agent. Does he crack the starting lineup again, or does he play a significant role? Is he a guy who played a lot because he was the best they had on a team that wasn't very good, or is he a legitimate find who can be a contributing player, someone you count on for an NFL on a quality team? Who steps up and makes the roster at defensive tackle? Again, Byron Young's not healthy to start camp. The door's open for guys like Neil Farrell and some of the other younger players who maybe haven't shown as much so far, but need big summers to make the roster and to solidify their future moving forward.
All right, let's switch over to the offensive side of the ball. Because to me, I think there's some interesting guys. I think Greg Van Roten is a guy that's trying to, does he stay a backup? I think he does. But can he put himself into the starting lineup? And Alex Bars, this is a guy that, blocked for the NFL's leading rusher last year. But they bring in Van Roten. They've got a McClendon Curtis, who's a UDFA. So I'm kind of setting him off to the side. Jermaine Illuminor. I mean, I think Thayer Munford, there's going to be, even though the entire offensive line that started last year is back, I still think there's a lot of competition. I'm going to be watching that very close.
I agree. I think those spots again, like we said, the two spots that are solidified. You have Colton Miller, you have Dylan Parham. How do the other three shake out? I think we said Alex Bars. I think the Raiders' preference would be that he wins the right guard spot because he's younger. You can see more of a future for him. And then you have Greg Van Roten, who's a veteran you can plug in at different spots for guys who get hurt or guys who are ineffective and he needs to take over. At receiver, we said they have their two guys, locks set in Adams, Jacoby Myers. If Hunter Renfrow is not the slot guy, okay, well, is DeAndre Carter the starting slot guy? Does Trey Tucker step in as a rookie and play a lot at slot? Does Philip Dorsett carve out a role as a veteran speed guy for the team? And that's where the competition is. I think those guys, who's going to step in, who's going to surprise and catch the eyes of people at camp, that'll be something to watch.
You had just addressed something that I think is important to discuss. Dave Ziegler, this roster last year was an average roster speed wise. Obviously, the Raiders a couple of years ago lose Henry Ruggs, who just top end speed was amazing. But they added a bunch of speed this year. You go look at a Dorsett, a Trey Tucker, Jacorian Bennett, and others. There are still others. That's only three, but there are multiple others. They've added a ton of speed, haven't they?
They have, and that's a Raider trademark going back to the days of Al Davis, and I feel like that's something that's always going to stick with them. They're a big size and speed team. I mean, every franchise is, but they are really, really love speed. If you could run Al Davis, for better or worse, they wanted you on the roster, and I think that's something you've seen. Dave Ziegler now, they realized they had to get faster. They had to add that element to their roster at different spots. And I think they've tried to do that. And it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out. And, if the investments they made seem to be paying off early on.
Last thing I want to talk to you about, but in the past, there would be Raiders that got cut that didn't necessarily end up going and playing anywhere else. With this roster, the way it's shaped, the way it is, there's going to be guys cut that end up going immediately to other teams and play. That's Ziegler doing his job. I'm curious, they have a Matthew Butler and a Neil Farrell from last year that got to take a step forward. But on Dave Ziegler, how much pressure is on him? Because all he can do is assemble a roster. Then it's up to Josh McDaniels to cook dinner with it.
I mean, the GM has the ultimate sort of holistic responsibility for that roster. And I think that, people will say, obviously, the coach has the influence and he has to say there too. But fans will say, look, this is who Dave Ziegler put together, so we brought in, this is who they drafted. He's going to have to answer for it. And I think that there is, like always, there's pressure, like we said, to show that they're going in the right direction, that they've drafted solidly. They have some players who are developing and becoming potential key guys and guys that you can count on down the line. So I think there is a lot of pressure on him. And I think that we'll start to see in training camp how some of those players are developing and how they're looking. And I think as the season unfolds, we'll look at what he got right and what he got wrong. And hopefully for him and hopefully for the Raiders, the column of what he got right outweighs the column he got wrong.
All right, everybody. I'm Hondo Carpenter from Sports Illustrated's Fan Nation, part of the it is our Las Vegas Raiders Insider podcast, part of the Fans First Sports Network. He's Matt Halatic from thespun.com. Good to have you, Matt.
Always a pleasure. I can't believe camp's here, but I'm pumped.
I know it. Camp's here. Going to be fun. All right. Look forward to talking to you next week as we look at some guys that have emerged. Maybe some guys we'll talk about how are some guys doing in camp. It'll still be early, but we'll have some early looks. Look forward to having you, Matt.
Always a pleasure, man.
Thanks, buddy.